it's a pleasure to be here, really a pleasure to be here. I apologize for being less participatory. I had a terrible headache right in the middle of some talks, but I'm okay now, thanks to Hölderlin and Heidegger. Okay, fine. So, so I wanted to talk about, of course, also rhythm and temporality, and introduce an extra term of texture. And part of the reason for doing that is to try to think a bit about, try to speculate whether it's possible to talk about temporality without a priori subject, without assuming subjects beforehand. And then we'll go through a little story, and then in the course of this story, we remove the scaffolding, and then see if we can rederive some alternate notions of subjectivity. And along the way, I'll be also thinking about a way to think about a field-based way to think about rhythm and temporality, which would then perhaps suggest a different kind of subject that's includes the human, but doesn't have to only include the human, classical human. Okay, so, also what I'm going to do is I'll read a little bit, but I'll also lighten the discussion, showing you some experiments that we've been doing over the past 15 years in the Topological Media Lab, and more recently at the Synthesis Center, where we've been trying to produce or engage in what we might think of, what one might think of as philosophical experiments, or philosophically motivated experiments using responsive environments, working with dancers and musicians, and non-expert movers as well, and building these apparatuses for seriously playfully experimenting with the conditions of experience, or reconditioning experience, okay? So I'll read a little bit for introduction, then I'll show different kinds of experiments that we've done, and then I'll go back and try to draw some speculations out of that. Okay, so rhythm and textual temporality, experience without subject and duration as effect. I should put a question mark after that, okay? So let's begin with a simple and provisional proposition. Rhythm as a feature of experience rather than an abstract pattern arises from a body encountering variation in matter through movement. So if I have, here, okay? So I'm moving my body across inhomogeneous matter. So if this were perfectly homogeneous, I would not feel any rhythm. If I didn't have a body, I wouldn't sense. And without the motion, I wouldn't sense it either. Okay, but this is just provisional. So body, inhomogeneous matter, and movement together are the ingredients for rhythm in this initial formulation. Okay, and then we'll jazz it up. Notice that the corporeal movement compounds the body as a necessary ingredient in this experience. Feeling via embodied engagement is an inextricable component of experience. Thus, according to our formulation, our initial formulation, body, movement, and inhomogeneous matter are necessary for rhythm as sense. Regarding sense, Merleau-Ponty writes, the sensing being and the sensible are not opposite each other like two external terms. The movement of my hand, this is Merleau-Ponty, the movement of my hand subtends the form of the object. In this exchange between the subject of sensation and the sensible, it cannot be said that one acts while the other suffers the action, nor that one gives sense to the other. Without the exploration of my hand and prior to my body synchronizing with it, the sensible is nothing but a vague solicitation. Unquote. However, variation of matter and corporeal movement, while elemental as ingredients of a sense of rhythm, may not exhaustively account for the phenomenon. Rhythm as a temporal pattern in experience lies beyond or in between sense perceptions. One gets to a sense of rhythmic pattern via perception, but rhythm itself is not sense data. To borrow phenomenological vocabulary, rhythm is not perceived, but apperceived. The reader may find it completely, you may find it completely obvious that rhythm is not to be found out there, to be represented by sense or sensor data, engineering sensor data, but rather is a feature of lived experience, and thus inextricably part of phenomena rather than data. But in our present epoch, in the age of machine perception, sensor technologies, and big data and zombies, it seems useful to recall Merleau-Ponty's scientific meditations on temporal experience. He writes, "We are not saying that time is for someone, which would once more be a case of arraying it out and immobilizing it. We must understand time as a subject, and subject is time." This is a famous quote. Merleau-Ponty provides an integral account that steers clear of purely idealist as well as purely realist positions. Existence cannot be, he writes, existence cannot be anything, spatial, sexual, temporal, without being so entirely, or without taking up and assuming its attributes and turning them into the dimensions of its being, such that a relatively precise analysis of each of them, in fact, has to do with subjectivity itself. If we succeed in understanding the subject, this will not be in its pure form, but rather by looking for the subject in the intersection of its various dimensions, unquote. So in other words, felt time, digital space, felt time is not an abstract frame inside of which we position an event or individual under this account. Instead, the temporal sense is one aspect or one dimension of an individual's experience. Merleau-Ponty draws striking consequences about events from his experiential account. I quote, "The very notion of an event has no place in the objective world. When I say that the water currently passing by was produced by the glacier 2 days ago, I imply a witness fixed to a certain place in the world, and I compare his successive perspectives. There are no events without someone to whom they happen," unquote. Moreover, temporality as a relation between the subject and the world implies that, in Merleau-Ponty's words, time is neither a real process nor an actual succession that I could limit myself simply to recording. It's born of my relation with things. Departing, however, from the presumption of a pre-given Cartesian cogito, we do want to keep in play various commitments to notions such as subject, body, and time. At least I'll be doing that. Okay, let's bracket subject, body, and time. This methodological attitude draws from both a pragmatist, radically empirical approach based on experience, as found in the work of William James, and also Husserl's injunction to attentive phenomena themselves. Okay, so we will start from neither theoretical abstractions like time or numbered metric, nor unperceivable mechanism, but rather from lived experience. Succinctly put in the 1912 edition of William James' Essays in Radical Empiricism, as follows. "The only things that shall be debatable among philosophers shall be things definable in terms drawn from experience. The relations between things, conjunctive as well as disjunctive, are just as much matters of direct, particular experience, neither more nor less so than the things themselves." In other words, relations would be first-class entities and concepts in this theory, okay, in the radical empiricist approach. So we're going to be keeping in play notions such as subject, body, and time, rather than invoking them as primitive building blocks of experience, especially in our experimental work that you'll see in a few minutes, okay? And toward the latter part of this, we'll reverse our consideration and use our understandings of rhythm to derive some insight into what might be meant by temporal subject and temporality. This approach to rhythm that we describe also avoids commitment to a particular notion of the anthropic subject, whether phenomenological, psychological, or cognitive. In this sense, it shares with the pragmatism process philosophy and some aspects of contemporary materialism the proposition of experience without a subject. One of our method's most distinctive features is pursuing these philosophical questions, not only empirically, but experimentally. That's how we're going to be doing it. For us, or for me, to experiment means to reproducibly and precisely vary the conditions of experience, whole experience, okay? And to do it reproducibly and precisely is why we use computers. For us, okay, so this is quite different than reproducing the event or reproducing the experience in a rehearsed form for an audience, okay? So let me show you some of this kind of work. There are many different kinds of works, okay? I should probably contextualize this. So this is a dancer, Tayoma Nakarato, who working with John McCann, who is a experimental composer, maker of fundamental techniques in computational sound. They've been working now for about 5 years on a project involving the heartbeat. And in his case, he was looking originally at taking, he built some sensors so we can get the heartbeat, her heartbeat, and then going through a very complex set of compositional strategies, which he coded up in Maximus P. Jitter, turned them into click tracks, which were then transmitted to some musicians who could hear them through earphones, and they would play. But the rhythms are incredibly complicated. It's like, think of Nankaro or something, all right? Very complicated rhythms. Then he gave it up. When he started working together with her over the last few years, he began to basically learn these techniques for improvisatorily deriving rhythms or rhythmic strategies in rehearsal. This is early work. When they came to my synthesis center, she was at that point just learning how to use her breathing and motion of her body to modulate the beamed data reporting her heart. In other words, she wanted to control the heart rate, okay, which is usually autonomous, but learning to move, dance, breathe in such a way so she could control the heart rate a bit more precisely and reproducibly, okay? They learned that listening through the ears, it was very confusing. So when he gave her a click track to listen to, it was confusing her because she was producing, in a sense, sound from her heart. She was listening to sound and she was trying to match those together. So instead, what we did was we flooded the room with light from above, which is we have a theatrical system. So the light was colored, and the color was, I think, like blue if her heart rate was slower than the target rate, and let's say red, it was faster than the target rate, okay? The whole point was that there was nothing to look at. It was just the color of the field of illumination in the whole floor that she could pay attention to. So there was no image, okay?
So when it was the click track, it was almost like it was echoing.
Yeah, it's too much going on. Because you're hearing two patterns. You hear a pattern of rhythm, a pattern in time orally, and she was producing the pattern in time through the heart. In this case, it was just the difference in rate that was turned into color and the color field. Okay, so just give you a few seconds of what they were, just to give you a sense of what it's like to be in this kind of space. Okay, there's a lot more, so just give it. Now, I'm racing through years and years of work, okay? So with different experimentalists, we started to just start with not very naively thinking about rhythm and heartbeat in terms of the usual thing. Okay, so if you were to try to measure that, you would have these variations in amplitude, let's say from the microphone. So here's a graph, right? So the question would be, when is a beat? If you talk about beat tracking, well, when is a beat? So because if you just take a variation in intensity from a microphone, at some point you have to make a decision. This is the highest peak, so that's one. And then wait for another peak, that's another one. But this is a decision. A peak is a decision. In other words, anything above a certain threshold, you have to actually define what the threshold is. You have to actually make all sorts of algorithms and engineering to say, okay, the signal now is above this threshold. These are all decisions, okay? So even the question of a period is a decision. To us, it's kind of like, oh, of course, right? But to an engineer, this is very challenging because there's a naturalization of the notion of frequency, of period, of beat that happens all the time in technology. So even the notion of an event is a decision, and it's not just a philosophical question. So I noticed this when I was just looking out the window of a plane, prop plane, and just shot it with my little iPhone camera. Look at this. This is a takeoff. Left-hand side is takeoff, and then a few minutes later, and then much further later in the course of the journey. Okay, it's the same phone, but look at it. The rate at which the phone is sampling, the frame rate of the camera, yields very different, very different, I'll do it again, very different perceptions of what the frequency seems to be. All right? Because the rotor, the propeller is changing its turn. You see on the right-hand side, it's actually moving quite fast. So if you were to look at it with your naked eye, it's a blur. Okay? So it's quite striking. What it shows us is the artificiality or artifactuality of the apparent rhythm that's detected by a technology, any technology. Okay? Right? So the rate at which you are sampling interferes with the rate of the phenomena. And the apparatus that you choose, the condition apparatus you choose, the resultant of which is then defined as rhythm. I wrote this down deliberately in the syntax. And if those of you who are familiar with the algebra for quantum mechanics will see this, will recognize the syntax. The state of the observer, the state of the observed, the state of the apparatus. You take a quote inner product, you get this observed rhythm. Okay, this is a very concise way to represent the artificiality, artifactuality of something that engineers take as given, as data. Okay, we can talk about it later on. Okay, so this is why we begin to think about how we can actually go back and forth between what is assumed to be given rhythm or what is assumed to be given, body or observer. So that's the spirit in which we conducted all sorts of experiments. Here's another one. The question was entrainment. Okay, so when is a group of people coordinated? Okay, in this case, usually three or more. Thinking about three or more to avoid dyadic conventions. Okay, so in this case, I asked the three dancers, think of yourselves as one clock, and fill space. So whenever two bodies are too far apart, put some body part into that volume of two sparse space, and so you maintain density of body. To dancers, this makes perfect sense, and that's enough. Good dancers are able to just run with that kind of condition and then improvise. What we also did was this graduate student of mine who was both a composer and a programmer and a PhD student, Mike. We built these sensors that could measure the orthogonal, the normal to the part of the body. So we built little sensors that could wear them on their wrists. And why was that? Because we're thinking, instead of thinking about entrainment as people moving in the same way at the same time, here's entrainment like this, okay? Let's think about the following. If we hear a bang like this, everybody would turn their head faces to this direction, to this point at this time, okay? So we would all be orienting attention to this event right here, okay? So maybe another way to think about a joint intention and joint attention is to think about when do the different parts of different bodies make a turn in certain directions that converge. Now, the turns can happen different times. So maybe these people turn, and then you turn, and then you turn. That still is a coordination, but it happens not at the same time. So we built some mathematical correlation functions that could look at the normals to different parts of the body, like maybe the palm, the neck, or the belly, and then we do the math to try to measure correlations with shifting windows, all right, to when these different turns would happen. And are there correlations? I'm describing it poetically, but these are very specific functions you can write. Not trivial to compute, okay? So then that's the math part of it. And then there was the dance part of it. So later on, you're going to see here, turn that off, and turn on the right-hand side. So the musician who wrote the programs, he took this information about degree of correlation of orientation and used that to fed it to his music synthesis, which would become rougher when the correlation goes down. You hear it now. The third dancer decided to be deliberately uncorrelated with the other two by just dropping on the floor and stopping to move, just to see what happens. And then you begin to hear, in his case, because the correlation went down to 0, you could begin to hear this roughness because he built his music synthesis system to be rougher when the correlation went down. Okay? Now, this is not music, this is not art. Okay, this was just a way to get a very rich set of motion, to understand coordination, and to understand, to give a rich feedback to the degree of correlation, which is not merely a geometrization of moving things in parallel motion. Okay? Why do we do this kind of thing? It's because we want to understand in terms of the emergence of language, actually. This is 20 years of research on the emergence of language, the emergence of significant gesture, but in collective context. We've been trying to do now for almost 20 years, this kind of experiments in understanding under what conditions can people in a given common event invent fresh gestures that are meaningful to individuals and meaningful collectively. So this is one of the early motivations for the topological media lab. Okay. Another set of experiments, again on entrainment. This is done by one of my graduate students, Garrett Johnson, current graduate student. In this case, we're looking at three interacting systems. One is the bodies of the dancers, or just regular people. Another are the swinging pendula, swinging light bulbs, okay? And the third is a set of media instruments, software systems, that vary the light, the intensity of light, and the rich real-time sound instruments that are running. So there are three sets of dynamical systems that are interacting. Now, of course, with pendula, you know, there are natural periods. So that's quasi-regular. Then there are dancers' intentions. And then there are these very rich musical instruments, or light and sound instruments, that are written with their own logics and how to respond to the swing. Okay? So we won't have time to talk about this in detail. But this is an example of an apparatus that was designed from scratch in order to understand not just human interactions and entrainment of humans, but to understand the interaction of so-called natural physics and also of composer's intent, instruments designed with composer's intent, and also with dancers. Okay, so this is it looks simple, but it's actually a very interesting set of three sets of let's say, temporal forms. I'll say that. Okay. I think that's just to give you a sampling of the kind of work that we did. Okay, I'll come back to now. I don't have time to really describe the experimental work much, but we can talk about it. Okay. Textural rhythm. So let's examine more closely the formal assumption behind understanding rhythm as that which is denominated by a series of events, e.g. beats, indeed a series of the same. Between one downstroke of a baton and the next, between one clap of the hands and the next, does any rhythm happen? How can we say where one step ends and another begins? Segmentation reminds us of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's figure of striation. We are told, I'm quoting now from Thousand Plateaus, we are told that rhythm has nothing to do with the movement of waves, but rather it designates form in general, and more specifically the form of a measured cadenced movement. However, rhythm is never the same as measure. There is indeed such a thing as measured cadenced rhythm, relating to the coursing of a river between its banks, or to the river of a striated space. But there's also a rhythm without measure, which relates to the upswell of a flow. In other words, to the manner in which a fluid occupies a smooth space. Whoever was asking the question. From this we can take away, unquote, from this we can take away for the first caveat, to avoid conflating measure for rhythm, but also that movement is constitutive of rhythm, but not measure, metric, or other modes of striation. Indeed, as Pascal Michon has put it in his most extensive archaeology of the notion of rhythm, the Greek, and already Chris addressed this, the Greek word rhythmos simply signifies something like a form that is not permanent. This is Michon's interpretation. Or better yet, a way of flowing. Parts of this tradition provide us with tools that are much more convenient to deal with dynamic phenomena as art, ethics, and politics than the very narrow concept of rhythm that's today commonly taken for granted. This is Michon's reading, okay, and actually we found it very useful. Does it make sense to think of rhythm? Coming to unquote. Does it make sense to think of rhythm as? Does it make sense to think of rhythm of a single event, or would that be what Wittgenstein would consider an ungrammatically formed question that introduces unnecessary philosophical conundrums? Can what marks an event be discerned before the event, and who is to say? In Difference of Repetition, Deleuze writes, repetition is a necessary and justified conduct only in relation to that which cannot be replaced. Repetition as a conduct and a point of view concerns non-exchangeable and non-substitutable singularities, unquote. But what is the nature of the singular event? Taking the figure of a stroke of lightning, Deleuze writes, this is a beautiful passage, lightning, for example, distinguishes itself from the black sky, but must also trail it behind, as though it were distinguishing itself from that which does not distinguish itself from it, that is, the night sky. The night sky is indifferent. In this essay, I will embed denominations of rhythm marked by discrete, atomic, repeated events inside a more general and non-pre-dimensionalized substrate in which objects and events take form. The more nuanced and precise account uses notions from point-set topology, which I addressed in the book, Poiesis and Champion Topological Matter. We will adopt the term texture to refer to an approach to phenomena via dynamic material fields and substrates, in parallel with, but not reduced to, some recent physics theories that derive time as effects of, rather than pre-given backgrounds to the dynamics of quantum fields. I'll return to this at the end. Okay? I'm going to try to skip. Okay? For the interest of time. I'm going to skip a few things, okay? So pardon me for it. I'm going to skip some passages on entrainment. So if you want to talk about that, we can talk about it over drinks. In the three ecologies, Guattari dispenses with the term subject entirely, formulating subjectivity as three interpenetrating registers considered processually and interdependently, ecologically. The mental, the social, and the environmental. Guattari's proposition allows for the flux of experience without a subject to produce emergent subjectivities. In Cosmosis, he refers to a study by Daniel Stern, which characterized as transsubjective the experience of infants, which do not, quote, which do not disassociate the feeling of the self from the feeling of the other. Subjectivity is refigured a processual emergence through components of subjectification. He distinguishes the individual from subjectivity, which he characterizes as a terminal for processes involving human groups, social economic ensembles, and data processing machines. We keep in mind the danger of mistaking what we can discern for an adequate understanding of experience. Thus, this investigation simultaneously draws from scientific as well as ethical aesthetic problematics. Instead of referring to groups of individuals or networks of actors or systems of hierarchies, we can regard these ensembles as heterogeneous assemblages of matter, energy, affect, symbol, which in movement and sensation construct our concept of rhythm as a viscous, animated texture. In György Ligety's poem Symphonique, 1962, 100 metronomes, mechanical metronomes, are wound up to exhaust themselves at approximately the same time. It is essential that these metronomes be mechanical to allow for energetic physics and contingency. Very gradually, wait, who's seen this? Many people have seen this, right? Okay, it's really great. It was exhibited in Pompidou for some years ago. Okay, very gradually, as the machines wind down, and as your hearing attention wanders, okay, and relaxes and refocuses, waves of rhythm, you'll begin to detect waves of rhythm. You just listen to it. The rhythms that you hear probably differ person to person, right? Probably. Plus, the rhythms that each of you detect, you know this, it's not in the machines, it's not in the mechanism. They have their own ticks, but you're not hearing them. You're hearing composites, you're hearing interferences. So the rhythm that you hear is not the same as the mechanical rhythm of these metronomes, first of all. Plus, they're relational, they're interferences, and they depend on your expectation and your physiology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So this is a wonderful apparatus for understanding let's say, the contingent constructions of rhythm. Okay. This is why I'm saying rhythm is not perceived, but apperceived. Given this, we suggest that the rhythm's subject, that which hears the given rhythm, does not pre-exist the moment of the performance, but emerges in the course of the event as experienced. In light of this, we propose to consider this subject not as a pre-given constituent of rhythm, but rather as an effect of the rarefaction and condensation of textural fields in assemblages, territorializing and deterritorializing configurations of bodies, actions, passions, expressions that provisionally function together. And we consider rhythm in turn as a mode of temporality, by which we mean the sense of passage, becoming, change, dynamic. So how shall we understand the co-articulation of subjects? Every differential operator, an operator in Simondon's ontogenetic sense, acting on the textural material field of matter plus energy plus affect, can be co-constructed together with particular subjects and objects of experience and apparatuses or instruments of articulation. The subjects may be called hearing subjects, and the objects may be called rhythms in this more general dynamical field, constituting the structuration of experience.
Can you say that one more time? Which
Yeah.
was the hearing object?
So the subjects, okay, in quotes, okay, we'll say these are the hearing subjects. The objects in this setup would be the rhythms, for example, okay? So, but what we're saying here is that let's not assume that subjects and objects pre-exist the event. They co-articulate in the course of this event, okay? So that's just an approach. What rhythm especially picks out are the temporal aspects of these dynamics. We have reversed the arrow of consideration. Whereas we began this contribution thinking of rhythm as a resultant of body plus movement plus inhomogeneous matter, and the sense of rhythm as a resultant of subject's action in the world, now we have reversed this, starting with examples of rhythm in ensemble activity and deriving bodies, or maybe better, hearing subjects, and objects, that is rhythms, out of the dynamical inhomogeneities of assemblages. This is a mathematician's game, okay? Now, extending Husserl's model to the things themselves from phenomenology to our non-anthropocentric project will require conceiving experience without an a priori subject. So now to summarize, every differential operator produces vectorial, that is directed fields out of the manifold of experience. William James conjectured in his essays on radical empiricism vectorial relations of knowing that co-articulates parts of experience as knowers and the known. Okay. Also, I'm borrowing from Whitehead when I say vectorial. Okay. Now, in more nuanced accounts of temporality, understood as we stated above, as a sense of passage, becoming, change, or dynamic, one consequence of a primordial temporal vectoriality is the triadic ecstatic structure of temporality that we discussed before. The senses of past, present, and future. Let's see if I can skip something since we discussed this thing. Okay. Okay. Now, a classically constituted observer would see a local asymmetry which co-articulates three regions of the universe relative to each compact occasion. Okay, I don't want to say event. I could say event, but say one compact occasion. I'm implicitly borrowing language from Whitehead hopefully without confusing the discussion, because I'm not going to have time to bring in all this apparatus, okay, but occasion. Two regions are the retrospective and anticipated, what used to be called in physics causal past and causal future, okay? And the third would be the indeterminate portion of experience that has no material causal relation to the occasion, okay, this quote summative. Thus, rhythm can be understood as a structure of non-anthropocentric retention and protension inside textual dynamics of assemblages of bodies, actions, passions, and utterances. Okay? This is a proposal that rhythm, I'll do it again, rhythm can be understood as a structure of non-anthropocentric retention and protension, okay, inside these kinds of dynamics. But if we do not presume such a pre-constituted observer, how else could we understand the situation? Some physicists have okay, I'll leave this. It's distracting to see that thing. Come back. Yeah. Some physicists have recently begun to question quantum gravity models called loop quantum gravity, in which space-time are effects of the field dynamics. Okay. So in other words, thinking of time or maybe better duration as something that we can read out or measure given activity. Right? This is one of the possibilities given to us by Rovelli's work, Rovelli and colleagues' work. Okay. That was used to be quantum mechanics. You say momentum is something you measure, like the momentum operator is what you apply to a physical system, right? Using the formalisms of quantum mechanics, and can read out those kinds of information about the system. Whereas time in the classical setup of quantum mechanics is an independent parameter. But as has been discussed before, the possibilities that Rovelli and colleagues are proposing to us is that maybe even time itself can be read out as not an independent parameter, but as yet another field. Okay, I've been waiting for this for 20 years, so it's really, really quite exciting to hear that some mathematics being developed around that possibility. It's not by accident, because they are also reading a bit of philosophy in their work. Okay, loop quantum gravity, as the physical theory, does not account, however, for the felt experience of the difference between past and future and the sense of flow. It is still, after all, physics. Okay, indeed, loop quantum gravity's eventful world is a bubbling magma of occasions, rather than a differentiable manifold with a smooth metric that at every point marks out locally causal future, causal past, and acausal regions. Okay? Rovelli proposed in a talk at the Royal Institution that it is the selective arraying of disordered configurations as subsequent to more ordered configurations that give rise to the sense of anisotropy in the flow of time. Okay, this is, it's actually quite wonderful. Oh, no, I transcribed it here. In his words, it's better. What makes entropy, because, okay, the notion of anisotropy, the future different from the past and the flow going from past to future, this sense, okay? So he was appealing to the usual thermodynamic explanation of that. The thermodynamic explanation of the arrow of time would be things move from more ordered to more disordered, okay? So that, like the pile of sand example, or the balls are stacked up and then they just start bouncing around and start to distribute themselves to more disordered states, okay? So this is a usual thermodynamic way to explain there's an anisotropy, okay? So he starts with that, okay? But then he goes in and says something very interesting beyond that point, okay? Now, what makes entropy low down there in the past is not the fact that the universe was arranged in a very ordered way. The universe is arranged however it is arranged. This is loop quantum gravity, just bubbling sets of events out there, okay? It is the fact that we look at the universe, we as a physical system, interacting with the rest such that under this perspective, the past was special. We are special subsets of the universe that interact with the rest of the universe in such a way that the past looks ordered to us. What is special is not the universe. It's the subset of the universe to which we belong. We call this, he calls this the idea, the perspectival origin of entropy. Okay. Now I'm going to push this one more step. We can give this a bit of a propositional twist to be a little bit more radical. First, we adapt William James in the genealogy of Leibniz, Whitehead, Deleuze, and Guattari. In his 1912 essay, Does Consciousness Exist?, James writes, there's no general stuff of which experience at large is made. There are as many stuffs as there are natures in the things experienced. And earlier, he writes, if we start with this primal stuff, pure experience, then knowing can easily be explained as a particular sort of relation towards one another into which portions of pure experience may enter. The relation itself is part of pure experience. One of its terms becomes the subject or knower, or bearer of the knowledge, and the other becomes the known. Okay? And this is contingent. This kind of relationship can be contingent. Now, here's what I propose to do. Rather than presume, as Rovelli seems to do, pre-given subsets of the universe endowed with such perspectival entropy, instead, why don't we characterize contingent chunks of experience, borrowing from James, that happen to make such construals and call them temporal subjects as humans. Call that human. Okay? And the last part is this sense, this emergence of sense. And this is something we've been thinking about in seminar back in the Synthesis Center, but I'll propose it now as part of the speculation to close my contribution. Noah Brinder, who's a young philosopher back in Montreal, who I greatly recommend, been working with David Morris, has a very beautiful essay on Merleau-Ponty, Evan Thompson's work, and symmetry breaking. And the proposal, this is speculation which we need to do over drinks, is that could it be, this is what we were thinking about, could it be that the emergence of sense we can maybe think about as basically, one way to think about emergence of sense could be thinking in terms of the emergence of pattern, of sign, okay, of marks. But how could that happen? Well, here's a way to do it. Think about, we have a given space, and think about what makes a variation in the space. Here, for example, is a variation in the space, right here. This is an inhomogeneity, okay? What are the groups of transformations that carry this into itself? Suppose we're regular, okay? There are whatever, 30 sides. So there's a group of rotations, discrete rotations, of size 30, okay? Such that any one of those would just click, turn this into itself. So you would call that the symmetries that preserve this object, make this invariant. This one, perfect cylinder, you know this, that the group of symmetries is infinite. It's a circle of symmetries. They all carry this into itself. So, but all of these are subgroups of the group of symmetries that preserve space, the ambient space in which these things live. So there's a dual between the invariant objects and groups of symmetries that preserve the objects. We can go back and forth. Why do we talk about this? Because there's been some people, such as Alain Cohn, right, have been conjecturing, and me too actually, but I appeal to him for authority, that maybe the objects of experience, what are the objects of experience? It's those entities that are invariant under symmetries. It's a very beautiful, provocative idea. And I do think that maybe it wouldn't be a Pythagorean error to, it wouldn't be necessarily reductive to pursue that idea a little bit more. Why? Because we don't say that the symmetries are the symmetries of geometry. It's a big project, anthropologically speaking, historically, politically, to come up with what is a space, what is a symmetry, what is an object, okay? But this notion, this figure of thought, that maybe we can begin to think about invariance in terms of transformations on the space that leaves something invariant, as the beginning of thinking about what is the mark, what is the sign. Okay? Those are the objects of experience. If those are the objects of experience, maybe one way to think about that, to think about what is invariant under transformation or subsets of transformations. And what Noah Brinder has contributed in his essay is bringing over the notion of symmetry breaking. In physics, what symmetry breaking is, we take the space and take all symmetries acting in the space, right? And then when physicists say symmetry breaking, what they mean is take a subgroup of the group of all symmetries, and you look at what's been invariant under the subgroup, okay? And again, to be very clear, we're not talking about reducing life to physics. We're taking this figure of thought about, is there a way to think about marks as invariants, and we don't know what those are, okay? But then if we have that kind of notion, maybe we can begin to think about symmetry breaking as a beginning of a way to think about the emergence of mark, of trace, and then later perhaps even of language, who knows. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful. Also the illustrations. So my I think the last what was suggested at the end of your lecture, namely to redefine objects, matters of sense in terms of invariance under groups or subgroups of transformation. I think the important thing I think I heard you say is we should not presuppose the kind of space and the kind of group of transformation which we are operating. If not, we're kind of reinstating some kind of transcendental viewpoint. So it's also being experimental about the space of experience as a whole. So okay, but then I still have a hard time connecting to your idea of the kind of a virtual, emergent hearing subject. You said, okay. So maybe because I had to leave the room I missed the first part of your observations about Ligetti's piece, which I know. So how if I were to attend this performance live, okay, so I'm kind of embedded in the general overall situation as a body, as a sensing body, and I connect to this emerging, rhythm in the making. But I cannot abstract myself from my body. There are physiological thresholds that exist. As you said, they're not entirely arbitrary. I cannot do anything. I cannot hear any frequency. I cannot identify any kind of fluctuation. And so I have I'm okay with viewing myself as an emerging hearing subject, but then there are limits to the possibilities of expansion of my perceptions. How do you deal with the the necessities of embodiment?
Yes. Yes. I have a better example than this, which I should bring up now. The better example would be that I always use is when we look at dancers moving on the floor, working together, and they work 3 or more, let's say 10, whatever. It's really beautiful to see how fluidly you can see sometimes they move as a block. Sometimes it's 3 and 4. Sometimes 1 and whatever it was, 1 and 6. So moment by moment, what constitutes a body changes all the time. Okay. So another one would be violins in an orchestra when they learn to blow in unison, right? So, or you can break it up. So sometimes you see different sections blowing differently. So that's my classic example. Being a very bad violinist, a failed violinist, thinking how many violins are there? Usually there are 2, first section, second section.
Right.
Same thing with hearing. So then maybe in the case of rhythm, something like this would be say, how many hearing subjects are there? Well, you could, if you flip it and say, start with the rhythm. So what or who is hearing this rhythm? Well, it could be several people, it could be just one, it could be maybe, it could be more fine grained, it could be more like, I hear this and I hear that at the same time. So I'm part of a hearing subject that hears rhythm X. You see, start with rhythm X and you say, what are the subjectivities that we would point to that hear X? Just flip it around.
Okay.
Please, Stefan.
On the example of the airplane, the 3 videos that you showed us, where you see the image of a propeller in different speed, that made me think of the fact that audiovisual messages themselves, even if they look at us as a continuum, they are actually running at a rhythm of 23 frames per second. In the sense that a video is constituted of images playing quickly, and so that they look as a moving image altogether. My question is, what do we need to think about these rhythms that are invisible to our experience, but they still constitute in a certain way the way in which we perceive a certain kind of messages? And how does this relate in general to the electric age of media, which McLuhan depicts in Understanding Media?
This is why I asked Chris the question to open it up. Okay, now I have the answer, right? So, there's several things. One is the rhythms and the rhythms. That's why I'm thinking about the noise floor. The noise floor. You can say 24 frames per second, but actually there are many other, how do you say, latency thresholds or thresholds of perception that are in play all the time. So we know from, physiological experiments that what constitutes immediacy depends on the sense modality. So in the case of vision, it's about 30 frames per second, 1/30 of a second. But for touch, it's about 1/1000th of a second. That is, the delay has to be less than 1/1000th of a second for us to feel have to be coupled to the medium. Okay. But that can be varied. So that's one thing. So and then when we vary this up, please. I'll come back. The question was, what gives you a sense of precarity? Walking across the solid floor, it's sand, underneath there's sensors, okay? And it makes you feel like, I did it myself, that it's about to crack and going to fall through. So people always get really careful. They walk gingerly across the floor. It's really funny. Okay. Now, the projections of the pattern here, this back-to-type pattern, that's merely narrative. Okay, merely, in the sense of, why should I say merely? I'm going to do this again. No video, just listen. Does it feel dangerous to you? Sure. Okay. Now, this sound is constructed very carefully with very rich sound composition strategies and lots of engineering. And it's done by a composer, done by sound artists, to give you a sense of precariousness. Okay. And it's a composition in time where the precarity, I claim, comes from the rhythmic delay, from the delay structure. It's not random, it's not regular. If you're random, I would say that I wouldn't feel precarious. For regular, I would not feel precarious. It was designed, composed, to make you feel like you want to fall through. Okay, this is composition. Okay, now here, this is a good example, I think, right? Because, again, we can talk about it later. This is a good example.
Yes,
okay.
thank you.
What we can do.
For sure, thank you.
Shall we use that as a concluding note? We can talk about that over drinks?
Yes.